Hello everyone, Twisted Animatronic here, and trust me, by the end of this video you'll understand why the Mimic isn't as terrifying as people are making out to be. As we know, Secret of the Mimic's trailer has shown us tons of secrets, lore, and even hidden meanings sprinkled throughout. I've spent the past month going over all this information, and well, I can finally reveal the mysterious Mimic and whether it was evil or not. You see, believe it or not, in the game's canon, we have very limited evidence to go on. Sure, we have loads of background story in the books, but the book's lore might not actually happen in-game. So immediately, let's go on what we know about the Mimic from the games. And let's start with this interesting scene right here. As you can see, there's clearly body inside one of these mascot costumes. Now, we don't know how it's got there, but everyone is presuming the Mimic is the one who stuffed this body in that costume. Especially with the narrator saying that a prototype endoskeleton is basically on the loose.
We suspect it may be malfunctioning, so just be aware of the slim but non-zero chance that you could sustain significant injuries while attempting to retrieve it.
Now, at no point did they call it the Mimic or allude to the fact the Mimic is the one who's done this. But let's be honest, it's highly likely. So immediately you'd think this is an open shut case. Clearly the Mimic is extremely evil if it's done that, right? Well, for us to say that, we're going to need some context. And let's face it, the Mimic was created as a plaything/toy to keep the creator's son, David, occupied. And believe it or not, they actually become friends. Now, it's worth pointing out here, we haven't had any of this information in the games. This is coming from the book, so I'm trying to fill in the blanks. You see, the Mimic was a learning machine and starts learning and mimicking David's behaviors. They start playing together, they play hide and seek, they develop a bond, they were like best friends, and at no point did the Mimic hurt anybody. In fact, the creator Edwin actually likes the Mimic, so does David. They're best friends, they buy her ice cream and they buy her a TigerRock plush. Well, they actually make him the TigerRock plush, but that's besides the point. The key here is they're best friends. The Mimic isn't doing anything to harm David. Sadly though, David does die after being hit by a van. And because the Mimic is still acting like David, Edwin decides to viciously, angrily attack it, even though the Mimic's done nothing wrong. After that, Edwin goes completely missing. Now, already we have two conflicting stories. One side is obviously evil, because we're seeing bodies in this factory, which has come from someone or something, but the beginning of the Mimic story is completely different. He's completely harmless. And let's not forget, even in Ruin, we don't actually physically see him hurt anybody, although he is extremely manipulative. But I'll come on to Ruin later on. Now, officially, we don't know what led up to the events of Secret of the Mimic. You know, where we're going into the factory and it's presumed that the Mimic is the one taking control of all these mascot costumes. Again, that's not 100% confirmed, but we can kind of guess it is the Mimic controlling these costumes. Although the eyes do look very different from the eyes we see in Ruin. I mean, you just got to compare them both side by side. Sure, you could say Secret of the Mimic is set, 30, 40 years prior security breach? But the room in Ruin, the room we literally find him in, implies, and even Gregory himself implies, the Mimic has been down there a very, very long time. I mean, we literally see the mascot costumes from the 1979 Secret of the Mimic trailer in the ruined room, implying they've been there since. But it's still odd that they have different eyes, and one could literally argue the fact that we haven't actually seen the Mimic in the trailer, and we don't. We only see costumes and eyes peering out of the costumes, and so far the eyes are not the same as the ones we've seen in Ruin. And by logic, you literally say because they're not the same eyes, they're not the same person, right? Meaning this may not actually be the Mimic we're seeing in these costumes. It hasn't exclusively said anywhere that that was the case, just that a prototype Endo can fit in any costume and is potentially going around damaging people. So let's say for a second the Mimic didn't stuff any of these bodies we see in the trailer. That literally means that the Mimic from the 1979 trailer hasn't hurt anybody. That lines up with the Mimic still being a good guy. But let's say they just wanted a design change. So the eyes are just a design change, right? So they did go around and murder all these people. Look at it logically for a second. These random people have broken into a factory. Your factory where you live. You're the Mimic. Your creator has left you and you're doing what you're programmed to do. Potentially protect the factory. So these intruders, you literally try and stop. I mean, it'd give it a valid reason, but I don't want to go down that route. I kind of like the idea that the thing we're seeing in the trailer isn't exactly the Mimic just yet. And believe it or not, this also plays into security breach, because you see, in the book, the Mimic actually starts to find its own sentience, its own own being. And in the games, we've seen this before, although it was under a completely different spin, and I think it's gone completely unnoticed by everybody. Remember that controversial theory by literally Game Theory and MatPat about Gregory being a robot, and how they used the sticky notes to say a robot boy was living in the sticky post-it room and he was learning his sentience? Well, there are various things which actually line up with the mimic here more than the Greg bot theory. The first one is obviously the sticky notes themselves, where there's a machine talking in binary code. We see on various sticky notes the machine talking about why is I am coming into my own existence, wanting a family. The table itself, where you see the staff bots, could literally be the family which the mimic never had or did have but was taken away from it. Then we start to couple it with other things and it further makes sense. You see, in the trailer we see obviously the technician we're playing as have some type of Faz wrench. On this Faz wrench is an icon which kind of looks like a Wi-Fi signal, and I thought, well, that's odd. They don't have Wi-Fi in 1979, and you're right, they would never have Wi-Fi in 79. But this could literally be a symbol for throwing some type of noise or voice. And then we see the technician wind up a mouse and throw it to cause kind of like a distraction, a noise. People who played the demo at PAX was also saying that they were creating noise distractions for the mimic / Jackie to follow. And then this pairs with something in Security Breach. In Security Breach, there's a sticky note saying it's drawn to noise. Now, I don't think a Greg bot was drawn to any noise. The only thing we know that was drawn to noise is literally pointed to us in the trailer, and that is this mimic / Jackie. Now, you might be wondering why I'm talking about the noise and it being lured to the noise, but it's very important to link these clues together, because you see the post-it notes where it's on about the machine finding its own sentience, why was it created, etc., is literally the mimic finding its own existence. It doesn't know where it fits in the world. It doesn't want to be evil, doesn't know what it even is. It just wants to find where it belongs in the world and what it actually is. It's not set about to go and rip people to shreds or stuff people in suits at this stage. Security Breach is telling us whatever that thing was in that room, likely the mimic because of these clues I've just showed you, was finding its own existence. You see, the likelihood is here that whoever wrote that it's drawn to noise knew about the mimic living in the Pizzaplex. Now that does cause some problems, because if it was living in this post-it room, how would it have then ended up in the room beneath the Pizzaplex? Well, believe it or not, there is further evidence to suggest that the mimic hasn't been in that room the entire time, and if you want to follow the book's canon, it was never locked in that room the entire time. It was actually removed from the factory and brought to the Pizzaplex. This sounds awfully like the story of Secret of the Mimic in 1979, right? We're going to the factory to capture this prototype endoskeleton and then potentially bring it somewhere else. And here's the thing. I know it flashes 1979 in the initial trailer and the new trailer, I believe, but who's to say there isn't a time skip at some point and we play in two sets of time periods? The first initially when it was open and we're seeing all the toys being produced, and then later after they get shut down, a time passes, we come back to pick up the mimic and potentially the MXEX. I mean, we know from Security Breach that there's a whole area in parts and service where there's holding cells, literally, for holding people, animatronics. Who's to say they didn't take the mimic there and hold it there before moving it downstairs to the old abandoned pizzeria? I know, there's a lot less evidence for that, but that's still a theory at this point, and I did a big theory on that on the channel. If we wanted to, we could now say, well, based on all this information, that mimic was literally just trying to find his own sentience, live its own life, and therefore it's a good guy, right? That's not entirely true, you see, because there's something else, and that's his manipulation of Cassie and Ruin. You see, we know from Ruin that Cassie gets manipulated by Helpy and in turn manipulated by the mimic, because the mimic is literally controlling Helpy, right? But one could literally argue here that that mimic was literally looking for an escape, just wanted to be free, didn't want to attack Cassie, just wanted to use Cassie to open the way for it to become free. Kind of like what Freddy says when he goes down, where he clears the way and found himself for the first time, but we won't get into that. Although you could say that the mimic was trying to get into the animatronics to set itself free. And it's also worth pointing out here, we still don't know which ending in Ruin is the canon ending. Sure, the mimic chases us throughout the ending, so either way you look at it, the mimic is chasing Cassie at the very end. Whether that's to try and talk to her, to explain to her, or literally to use her as some type of skin suit, like, you know, the Fun Times do with Mike and Ennard, we can't 100% say for certain yet. But what we can say so far on the evidence is that the intentions are not 100% evil, given the circumstances circumstances and evidence. That is, if A, the mimic didn't kill them people and put them in the suits, and B, if they did, the mimic was literally looking at them as some type of intruder. I mean, the animatronics in FNAF 2 had the same ability to scan potential Patreons as if they were criminals, and if they did, well, we know what happens. They grab them and try and stick them inside of suits. The mimic could have literally had the same type of technology, or a very primitive version of it anyway, resulting in the people who were in the factory unauthorized to be grabbed, stuffed inside of suits. Unfortunately for these people, Edwin could have already put endoskeletons inside of these suits, and therefore the mimic would have been stuffing them in these suits with endoskeletons. Would have been a bit of a mess. But despite all of this, there's still something which is racking around in my brain and doesn't fit quite clearly, and that's the fact that if Fazbear Entertainment went back to collect this mimic and was successful, they would have took it to their new pizzeria, right? And used that technology. That makes sense then why the mimic kind of was in an abandoned pizzeria below the Pizzaplex. It seems likely that in Secret of the Mimic, we're going to be successful in retrieving the mimic, taking it to one of their new pizzerias, which we know are opening very soon. We literally see the poster in the Secret of the Mimic demo / trailer saying that the Fazbear restaurant is coming soon. So we, the protagonist in the game, capture the mimic, take it to their new pizzeria. Something happens. Fazbear Entertainment do what they do best, decide to bury that pizzeria completely, and I mean literally bury it underground, potentially under another pizzeria, which lines up perfectly then with Security Breach, because if you remember rightly, when you go down the sinkhole, you land in the FNAF 6 pizzeria. That's evidently the case. It matches scene for scene. But the mimic isn't in the FNAF 6 pizzeria. The mimic's below that, literally in another sinkhole. You have to go through the floor, a hole in the floor, to get to the mimic's room. Therefore, below the FNAF 6 pizzeria. So it's quite obvious that we take the mimic, take it to this pizzeria, something happens, it gets demolished, another pizzeria is built on top of it, and they're hoping the mimic's going to stay buried down there. Obviously that doesn't happen because of the events of Security Breach and Ruin. I know, that's a lot to take in there, it really is, but there's still the mystery of the MXEX and whether the mimic is actually good or bad. And the thing I think here, which it all boils down to, is the fact that the mimic wasn't built intentionally to be evil or bad. It starts off being a best friend to David, gets attacked and provoked, and I do believe all of Edwin's agony and rage got injected into that metal of that mimic. But because the mimic is already finding sentience, it's kind of like having weird emotions and tendencies. It's trying to find out who it is, and at the same time what it was built for, what's its purpose, but has this blinding agony and rage imparted from Edwin. Kind of like the puppet, I suppose. Is the puppet good or is she bad? The same thing with the mimic. I think the mimic started out good, but all that agony and resentment has been seeping into the mimic's programming, corrupting it over time, all while it's trying to find its own sentience and its purpose and its belonging. And well, we're gonna have to see how that ends up. But I don't think it's as black and white as the mimic is purely evil or the mimic is purely good. Unlike the Afton era, where we can kind of say that Afton was a being pure evil. But that's another story for another day. And with that being said, I'm shutting the door on this theory. And what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, check out all my other videos on the channel, such as why, believe it or not, the Secret of the Mimic is actually been lying to us about the plot the entire time. Did that video last week? Highly recommend checking it out. With an extra special thanks to the security guards which keep this pizzaplex running, with an extra special mention to Lauren and Penguin Lover 12. And let's not forget you for watching right through to the very end. Thank you very much. I'm Twisted Animatronic, and stay safe out there, superstars.